The city of Chicago, with its iconic skyline and vibrant neighborhoods, holds a dark and disturbing secret, a pattern of death spanning decades that some researchers, activists, and former law enforcement officials believe points to the existence of one of America's most prolific, yet unrecognized, serial killers. Since the 1990s, the bodies of over 50 women, predominantly black and often from economically disadvantaged communities, have been discovered strangled and discarded in desolate locations across the city's south and west sides, their deaths frequently classified as isolated incidents, despite haunting similarities in method and victimology. This terrifying pattern, largely ignored by mainstream media and only reluctantly acknowledged by authorities, has led to the emergence of the name the Chicago Strangler, a moniker for a phantom whose potential existence forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about justice, race, and which victims society deems worthy of attention. The story of the Chicago Strangler begins not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow, chilling accumulation of cases that initially seemed unrelated: women found in alleys, vacant lots, abandoned buildings, and along riverbanks, often partially clothed and with personal items missing. Their deaths initially ruled as homicides, but quickly relegated to the growing pile of cold cases in a city grappling with pervasive violence. What connects these tragedies is not just the manner of death, manual strangulation being a dominant, intimate method that suggests a desire for control and domination, but the specific vulnerability of the victims, many of whom were involved in sex work, struggled with addiction, or lived transient lifestyles that made them easy targets for a predator who understood their disappearances might not prompt immediate or sustained investigation. This calculated selection of victims speaks to a killer who possessed not only violent impulses, but a shrewd understanding of how to operate within the blind spots of both law enforcement and society, preying on those he believed would attract minimal attention, even in death. The geographic clustering of these murders provides some of the most compelling evidence for a connected series, with bodies consistently discovered in specific areas of the city's south and west sides, regions historically burdened by systemic neglect, poverty, and inadequate police resources, creating a map of terror that outlines a hunting ground familiar to the killer. These areas, characterized by abandoned industrial structures, vast empty lots, and limited street lighting, provided the perfect environment for someone to commit violence without witnesses, dispose of bodies without detection, and escape without leaving behind the kind of evidence that might quickly lead to arrest in more affluent neighborhoods. The killer's apparent knowledge of these urban landscapes suggests someone intimately familiar with Chicago's forgotten corners, possibly a resident, a frequent visitor, or someone whose profession granted them unrestricted movement through these neighborhoods at all hours. The timeline of these murders presents another disturbing pattern, with clusters of deaths occurring in specific periods, particularly the early 2000s and again around 2010, followed by stretches of relative quiet, a pattern that could indicate the killer was periodically active, perhaps incarcerated for unrelated offenses during the lulls, or that external factors in his life influenced his cycles of violence. During these peak periods, women vanished with alarming frequency, their families often reporting them missing only to face bureaucratic hurdles and lack of urgency from authorities, until their bodies were discovered weeks or months later, often in advanced states of decomposition that complicated forensic analysis and made cause of death determinations challenging. This stop-start pattern has further obscured the connections between cases, allowing them to be investigated in isolation by different detectives across different precincts and years, preventing the consolidation of evidence that might have revealed the broader pattern much earlier. The response from law enforcement and city officials to the theory of a serial killer has been characterized by denial, deflection, and a reluctance to acknowledge the possibility that one individual could be responsible for such a significant number of murders, often attributing the deaths to the broader context of Chicago's violence, or suggesting they were the work of multiple unrelated offenders. This institutional resistance has frustrated victims' families and community advocates who see it as a failure to prioritize the lives of Black women and a continuation of the marginalization these women experienced in life, their deaths seen not as tragedies demanding full resources, but as statistics inevitable in a violent city. Only in recent years, due to relentless pressure from families and the work of journalists and independent researchers, has there been any official movement toward re-examining these cases for potential connections, though many believe this effort remains underfunded and half-hearted compared to investigations into serial predators targeting more privileged victims. The victims of these crimes were far more than their tragic endings. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends, women with dreams, talents, and complexities that have been overshadowed by the circumstances of their deaths and the media's neglect of their stories. Among them was an aspiring poet who found solace in writing, despite her struggles with homelessness, a woman remembered for her infectious laughter and unwavering loyalty to her children, and a community volunteer who helped others even as she battled her own demons, their lives representing a cross-section of resilience and humanity that deserved protection and justice. Remembering them as individuals rather than statistics is crucial to understanding the true cost of these crimes and the importance of continuing to seek answers long after the headlines have faded and the public's attention has moved on to other stories. The investigation or lack thereof into these connected murders raises difficult questions about resource allocation, racial bias in policing, and which victims receive the full weight of justice in the American criminal system, questions that extend far beyond Chicago to cities across the country, where similar patterns of violence against marginalized women have been overlooked. Families of the victims have been forced to become investigators, advocates, and persistent voices for justice, organizing marches, pressuring officials, and maintaining databases of information when official channels failed them, their love for their lost loved ones fueling a movement that refuses to let these women be forgotten. Their efforts have occasionally yielded small victories, such as the reclassification of certain deaths as homicides or the reopening of cold cases, but the ultimate goal of identification and arrest remains elusive, a distant hope that sustains their decades-long fight for closure. The profile of the Chicago Strangler, pieced together from the patterns of the crimes, suggests an offender who is organized, patient, and deeply integrated into the community, possibly someone with no criminal record or with a history of non-violent offenses that wouldn't draw suspicion, a man who appears ordinary and unthreatening to those around him. His ability to avoid detection for so long indicates a careful planner who understands forensic techniques, likely uses a vehicle to transport victims, and selects dumping grounds in areas where he feels confident operating without observation, skills that could point to someone with military, law enforcement, or security experience, or simply a cunning individual who has learned through trial and error how to evade capture. The emotional detachment required to commit such intimate violence repeatedly suggests profound misogyny and possibly racial animus, a desire to exert power over women he views as disposable, a pathology that may manifest in controlled ways in his public life while finding full expression in his secret actions. The possibility that the Chicago Strangler could be multiple offenders rather than a single individual has been put forward by some skeptics who argue that the sheer number of victims and the span of time involved make it more likely that several killers are responsible, each operating independently but selecting similar targets and methods by coincidence. While this theory cannot be entirely dismissed, the consistency in victim type, method of killing, and disposal sites across decades suggests a level of pattern that leans toward a single offender or a small number of copycats who were inspired by earlier unsolved murders, a phenomenon seen in other serial killer cases, where media coverage or local lore about a predator can influence other violent individuals. Without definitive forensic evidence such as DNA or conclusive witness descriptions, the debate between one versus multiple killers remains theoretical, a frustrating limbo that hinders the investigation and leaves families without clear answers. Modern forensic science, particularly advances in DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, offers a potential path forward for these cases, as evidence preserved from crime scenes, however degraded by time and the elements, might still yield usable genetic material that could be matched to databases or used to build family trees that identify the perpetrator. The challenge lies in the coordination and funding required to re-examine dozens of cases across multiple jurisdictions, a massive undertaking that demands political will and resource commitment that has thus far been lacking. Despite the efforts of advocates to highlight the urgency of the situation, the recent solved of other decades-old cold cases across the country provides a template and hope that similar approaches could be applied in Chicago, but without centralized leadership and prioritization, these women may continue to wait for justice that never comes. The story of the Chicago Strangler is ultimately about more than one potential killer. It is a stark examination of how inequality, systemic bias, and institutional failure can create conditions where violence can flourish undetected for years, claiming lives that deserved protection and remembrance. It forces an uncomfortable conversation about which lives are valued in our society and which are deemed expendable, a hierarchy of grief that determines the allocation of investigative resources and media attention, often to the detriment of poor communities of color. For the city of Chicago, confronting the possibility of a serial killer operating with impunity for decades requires acknowledging these failures and committing to a new approach that honors the victims through action, rather than empty promises, a reckoning that is long overdue for the families who have waited years for answers. What are your thoughts on the Chicago Strangler theory? Do you believe the evidence points to a single serial killer, or are these tragic but unrelated crimes? Share your detailed theories and insights in the comments below. The archives of the Penance Files are always open for thoughtful discussion and collective investigation by our community of dedicated mystery enthusiasts. And if you believe that every victim of crime deserves justice, and that every mystery, no matter how complex or cold, deserves our persistent pursuit of truth and resolution, then please subscribe to our channel and tap the notification bell to join us as we continue to seek answers, honor the forgotten, and explore the darkest chapters of criminal history in our relentless quest for understanding. Next on the Penance Files, the Colonial Parkway Murders, Virginia's Highway of Secrets. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story from the archives.